The air in Alistair Blackwood's cavernous bedroom was thick with the scent of old money and impending death. Shadows clung to the corners of the room, dancing over gilded furniture and tapestries that had witnessed generations of secrets. Alistair, a tycoon who had once made markets tremble with a single word, was now just a fragile outline beneath a mountain of silk sheets. His breathing was a faint, shallow whisper, a stark contrast to the booming voice that had once commanded boardrooms. At the foot of his grand four-poster bed stood his three children, more like statues of impatience than grieving family. There was Richard, the eldest, his face a cold mask of calculation, already running the numbers on his inheritance. Beside him was Isabella, adorned in jewels that glittered like unshed tears, her sorrow as performative as a stage play. And then there was Samuel, the youngest, a bundle of nervous energy, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape. They weren't waiting for a final goodbye, they were waiting for a final signature. Alistair's gaze, clouded but still sharp, drifted over them. A ghost of a smirk touched his thin lips. He knew them. He saw the avarice that had replaced love, the entitlement that had smothered respect. His eyes then found her, a figure standing silently near the doorway, almost lost in the gloom. Eleanora Vance, his maid. For 30 years, she had been the quiet constant in his tumultuous life, the keeper of his home, and an unknowing witness to the slow decay of his family. He had one last move to make, one final, masterful play. His voice, though a mere thread, sliced through the tense silence. "Solve this riddle, and you'll get my fortune." He smirked, a final challenge glinting in his eyes. Before we start, like this video and comment where you are watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories. Now let's begin. The 4 words, "You'll get my fortune," landed in the oppressive silence of the room not with a bang, but with a strange, dissonant thud. For a moment, no one moved. The proposition was so bizarre, so out of place in the solemn theater of a deathbed, that it seemed to short-circuit the greedy anticipation in the room. The children stared at their father, their expressions shifting from feigned sadness to a collective, unblinking confusion. The grand, somber narrative they had prepared for, the tearful goodbyes, the final words of wisdom, the swift transition to the lawyer's office, had been derailed by this sudden, senile detour. Richard was the first to recover, his face hardening like setting concrete. He saw this not as a game, but as a complication, a legal loophole being created in real time by a failing mind. A wave of hot, impatient anger washed over him. He had canceled 3 board meetings and a flight to Tokyo for this. He was here to witness a closure, a finalization of a lifelong transaction, not to be subjected to the nonsensical whims of a delirious old man. He took a half step forward, his voice a low, controlled growl meant to convey authority and reason. "Father, this is no time for childish games," he said, his tone sharp with the condescension he usually reserved for incompetent junior executives. "Let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be. The lawyers are waiting. Your will is clear. Just tell us your final wishes so we can ensure they are respected." The subtext was clear. Stop this foolishness and die properly. He straightened his silk tie, a gesture of reasserting order in the face of chaos. He was already framing the argument for the inevitable court case, testamentary incapacity. Isabella, ever the dramatist, saw the situation not as a legal problem, but as a social embarrassment. How utterly undignified. She imagined having to recount this story to her friends at the country club. "Oh, you won't believe what Daddy did at the very end. It was all so terribly strange." She let out a soft, theatrical sigh and glided closer to the bed. Her expensive perfume momentarily overwhelmed the scent of medicine. She reached out, intending to pat her father's hand, but stopped just short of touching his papery skin. "Oh, Daddy," she cooed, her voice dripping with a sweet, patronizing pity. "You're confusing us. You've had a long, hard life. You're tired. Please, just rest now. Don't trouble your mind with these puzzles." She looked at Richard over their father's head, her eyes rolling in a silent, shared moment of exasperation. Her role was clear, to be the gentle, loving daughter, soothing the senile patriarch while her brother handled the grim logistics of the estate. Samuel, meanwhile, just looked lost. He stared at his father, then at his siblings, his mouth slightly agape. A riddle for the fortune? It didn't make sense.
His mind, less accustomed to the ruthless calculations of his siblings, simply stalled. He felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. Nothing with his father was ever simple, and this felt like the most complicated thing of all. He wanted to say something, but what? He opened his mouth, a weak but escaping before Richard shot him a withering glare that silenced him instantly. Alistair watched them. Oh, he watched them all. And in the depths of his failing body, a cold, grim satisfaction bloomed. This was not delusion. This was the clearest, most lucid moment he had in months. Their reactions were exactly as he had predicted, as if he had written the script for them himself. Richard's dismissive anger, Isabella's shallow pity, Samuel's weak-willed confusion. They were parodies of the very flaws he had cultivated in them. He had given them everything, money, education, status, but had withheld the one thing that might have saved them, a struggle. They had never had to work, to think, to truly see anything beyond the reflection of their own entitlement. He had spent a lifetime building an empire of steel and stone, but his true legacy were these three hollowed-out people, and he would not reward them for it. This riddle wasn't a game. It was a final audit of their souls. It was a test, not of intelligence, but of attention. Had any of them in all their years ever bothered to know him, to listen to his stories, to read the books he loved, to understand the man behind the money? He ignored their protests. Their voices were just buzzing flies in the grand cathedral of his final purpose. He drew in another breath, a monumental effort that seemed to pull all the remaining energy from his limbs. His eyes, for a second, seemed to clear, the cloudy film receding to reveal the piercing, intelligent gaze that had terrified his competitors. He held his children captive with that look, silencing them with the last vestiges of his immense authority. Then he posed the challenge, his voice a dry, rattling whisper that demanded the room's absolute silence. "I have no taste," he rasped, the words hanging in the air, like dust motes in the light. He paused, letting the line sink in. Their faces remained blank, uncomprehending. "I have no voice, but I can command kings." Richard's jaw tightened. This was pure nonsense. "I have no hands, but I can shatter stone." He delivered the final line with a faint, almost imperceptible emphasis, a last clue for an audience that wasn't even listening. "What am I?" The question echoed in the silent room. Alistair held their gazes, his weak smirk daring them to find an answer. The children stared back, their faces a mixture of contempt, pity, and annoyance. They weren't trying to solve a riddle, they were diagnosing a symptom.
They saw a dying old man, his mind fractured and lost in delusion. They didn't see the lock, and they didn't see the key. Across the room, unnoticed, Eleanora Vance stopped polishing the silver frame. She stood perfectly still, her head bowed slightly, listening. The silence that followed Alistair's riddle was a living entity. It was thick and suffocating, weighted down by the collective impatience of his children. The grandfather clock in the hall seemed to tick louder, each second a hammer blow against their composure. Richard stared at his father, his jaw set in a tight line of frustration. He had already mentally dismissed the riddle and was now simply waiting for the inevitable biological process to conclude. He saw only a broken old man, a final, flickering circuits in a brilliant mind now gone dark. Isabella fanned herself lightly with her hand, a gesture of bored annoyance. The whole affair was becoming terribly morbid, and worse, terribly dull. Samuel just shuffled his feet, avoiding eye contact with anyone, wishing he could dissolve into the expensive Persian rug beneath him. To them, the riddle was a dead end, a meaningless question from a man whose words no longer held value. They were waiting for a doctor, a nurse, anyone to step in and end this bizarre, final chapter. And then, from the part of the room they had long since ceased to notice, a voice emerged. It was not loud, it was not dramatic. It was a soft, steady tone, yet it cut through the tense atmosphere with the clarity of a crystal bell. "It is time." All three children turned, their heads snapping in the direction of the sound with unified shock. It was Eleanora. She had stepped out from the penumbra of the doorway, moving into the dim amber glow cast by the bedside lamp. She looked small and unassuming in her simple, dark uniform, a stark gray figure against the room's riot of color and wealth. For a moment, the Blackwood children simply stared, their minds struggling to process the sheer audacity of it. The maid!
the maid was speaking. It was as if a chair had suddenly offered an opinion. But Nora wasn't looking at them. Her gaze was fixed solely on the man in the bed. Her expression was not one of triumph or cleverness. It was one of deep, sorrowful understanding. She saw not a tycoon playing a final, cruel game, but a lonely boy at the end of his life, reaching for a memory from his childhood. She knew the riddle not because she was a genius, but because she was a witness. She had seen the book. It was a small, unassuming volume with a cracked leather cover. Its title echoes in the gloom, long since faded. It was always on his nightstand, right next to the photograph of his mother. His children, who had filled his house with their noise and their demands, had never once seen him open it, but Nora had. In the quiet, lonely hours of the night, when the house was still, she had sometimes seen his door ajar. She had seen him, under a single reading lamp, tracing the words on the page with a trembling finger, his lips moving silently. She knew it was his mother's book, the one tangible piece of his impoverished childhood he had kept, a relic from a time before the empire, before the fortune, before the coldness had set in. She took another quiet step forward, her presence now commanding the room more than any of the Blackwood heirs ever had. "I have no taste, but I can devour all things," she repeated softly, her voice filled with a gentle cadence as if she were reciting a prayer. "It devours youth and beauty and empires." She looked at Alistair, whose eyes were now locked on her, a flicker of something unreadable stirring in their cloudy depths. "I have no voice, but I can command kings. It brings the mightiest rulers to their knees. I have no hands, but I can shatter stone. Given enough of it, it will turn mountains to dust." She paused, letting the weight of the old words settle in the room one last time before delivering the final, simple truth. The answer is time. The effect on Alistair was not subtle. It was seismic. It was as if a bolt of lightning had shot through his frail body. The cloudy film over his eyes seemed to vaporize, replaced by a sudden, shocking clarity. The weak, mocking smirk that had lingered on his face was wiped away, and in its place was a look of pure, unadulterated astonishment. He stared at Eleonora, and in that moment, he was not looking at his maid. He was seeing the one person in his entire world who had paid attention. She hadn't seen a bank vault. She had seen a man. She knew about his mother. She knew about the book. In his final desperate test to see if anyone had ever truly known him, the answer had come from the most unlikely person in the room. His chest hitched. A gasp, sharp and sudden, escaped his lips. It wasn't a gasp for air. It was a gasp of realization. A lifetime of overlooking the quiet, constant presence in his life culminated in this single, breathtaking moment of revelation. He tried to speak her name. His lips formed the syllable, a weak, voiceless "no-ra." But no sound came out. He tried to lift a hand, to reach for her, but his muscles betrayed him. All he could do was stare, his eyes wide with the storm of emotions, shock, regret, and a strange flickering light that might have been gratitude. It was the last light to shine there. With that final silence acknowledgement, the energy that had surged through him vanished as quickly as it had come. His body, which had been rigid with shock, went slack against the pillows. A long, slow breath shuddered out of him, a final surrender to the very force Nora had named. The tension left his face. The brief, stunning clarity in his eyes faded, leaving them glassy and fixed on a point beyond the ornate ceiling. Alistair Blackwood was gone. The room fell into a new kind of silence, one that was absolute and empty. The ticking of the clock now seemed impossibly loud, an indifferent narrator to a story that had just ended. The children stared, first at their father's still form, then at the maid. They had seen what happened, but they hadn't understood it. To them, Eleonora had uttered a lucky guess, a random word, and it had coincided with the moment of their father's death. "Well," Richard said finally, breaking the silence with a cold, practical finality, "it's over." He had already turned his mind back to logistics, to phone calls that needed to be made. Isabella simply shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself. "How unpleasant," she whispered, as if the maid's participation had been a breach of etiquette. The profound, life-altering event that had just transpired had flown completely over their heads. They had no idea that they had just witnessed not only the end of their father's life, but the end of their inheritance. The law offices of Abernathy, Finch, and Thorne were located on the 50th floor of a skyscraper that pierced the city skyline like a shard of smoked glass. The conference room was a testament to sterile corporate power. A single colossal table of polished mahogany stretched across its length, its surface so reflective it seemed to hold a darker, upside-down version of the room. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, godlike view of the sprawling metropolis below, a concrete kingdom that Alistair Blackwood had helped build and bend to his will. The air was cool and still, smelling faintly of expensive leather and industrial-strength floor polish. It was a place designed for high-stakes negotiations and the dispassionate dismantling of fortunes, and the atmosphere was as cold and unforgiving as a tomb. On one side of the table sat the Blackwood heirs, a united front of simmering resentment and absolute certainty. Richard, at the head, had adopted the posture of a chairman about to preside over an inevitable merger. He had his father's will memorized, or at least the version from 5 years ago. He expected a few minor, sentimental bequests to distant relatives or charities, followed by the lion's share being divided amongst the three of them, with a controlling interest in the company naturally falling to him. This meeting was a formality, a tedious but necessary step before he could finally get to work undoing his father's more archaic business practices. Isabella sat beside him, clad in a flawlessly tailored black dress that was the very pinnacle of mourning chic. She radiated an air of tragic boredom, as if the reading of a will was a rather dreary piece of theater she was forced to endure before the real celebration could begin. Samuel was a nervous wreck, fidgeting with the cufflink on his shirt, his eyes darting from the panoramic window to the stern, impassive face of the lawyer. On the other side of the vast wooden expanse sat Eleanor Vance. She was an island of simple gray wool and an ocean of bespoke tailoring. The chair, upholstered in plush Italian leather, felt ridiculously large, as if it might swallow her whole. She had been summoned by a formal, intimidating letter and had come out of a sense of final duty to the man she had served for 3 decades. She felt the chasm between their world and hers more acutely than ever before. The children had barely acknowledged her presence, their eyes either sliding past her as if she were a piece of furniture or occasionally flicking towards her with a look of mild, questioning irritation. "Why is the help here?" their expressions screamed. Nora simply sat with her hands folded in her lap, her gaze directed at the polished surface of the table, feeling profoundly and uncomfortably out of place. At the head of the table sat Mr. Abernathy, a man who seemed as old and timeless as the legal code itself. He had been Alistair Blackwood's lawyer for 40 years, a contemporary who understood his client's brilliant, often cruel mind better than his own children did. Abernathy's face was a roadmap of dry wrinkles, his expression a carefully maintained mask of professional neutrality. He knew exactly what was in the document before him, and he was braced for the storm. He cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound that seemed to suck all remaining warmth in the room. "We are gathered today," he began, his voice a monotone drone, "for the reading of the last will and testament of Mr. Alistair Blackwood, dated 1 week prior to his passing." He carefully unfolded the crisp, heavy document. Richard leaned forward slightly, a predatory glint in his eye. This was it. "I, Alistair Blackwood," Abernathy read, "being of sound mind and body." He continued through the standard legal preamble, the words washing over the children, who were listening only for the numbers, the percentages, the proper nouns that would confirm their destinies. Then, Abernathy paused. He looked up over the rim of his spectacles, his gaze sweeping over the expectant faces before landing, for a fleeting second, on Nora. "The document continues," he said. His tone shifted, almost imperceptibly. "I hereby declare all previous testaments, codicils, and verbal agreements to be null and void. This document represents my final, unassailable wishes." Richard's confident posture stiffened. Isabella stopped examining her manicure. That was new. Abernathy returned to the will, his voice steady. "I have spent my life building an empire, and I have learned that the greatest currency is not money, but attention. My fortune is not a prize to be claimed, but a legacy to be earned. Therefore, it is my decree that my entire estate, in its totality, without exception, including all shares in Blackwood Industries, all real estate holdings, all liquid assets, and all personal effects, shall be bequeathed to the single individual who first provided the correct and complete answer to the riddle I posed upon my deathbed." For a full 10 seconds, the only sound was the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. The words hung in the air, nonsensical, impossible. Then, the dam broke. "This is preposterous," Richard erupted, his voice a strangled roar as he slammed his palm flat on the table. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. "This is a joke. He was senile. He was a dying, delusional old man. We have a dozen witnesses. This will is the product of a compromised mind, and it will not stand."
"It's insane!" Isabella shrieked, her carefully constructed mask of grief shattering to reveal a face twisted with ugly, grasping fury. "He was rambling. You can't give everything away based on a lucky guess from a servant." Her eyes, filled with venom, darted to Nora. Mr. Abernathy remained perfectly still, waiting for the initial tidal wave of rage to recede. When Richard finally paused to take a breath, the lawyer calmly reached into his briefcase. He produced a second, thinner folder and slid a single, heavy document across the table. "Your father anticipated this challenge, Richard," Abernathy said, his voice cold as steel. "That is a full psychiatric evaluation conducted by Dr. Julian Croft, the nation's leading neurologist. It is signed and dated 7 days ago. It declares your father to be, and I quote, of exceptionally sound mind, demonstrating advanced cognitive and strategic faculties, and legally competent in all respects." Richard stared at the document as if it were a venomous snake. The official letterhead, the crisp, authoritative signature, it was an ironclad fortress against any legal challenge. It was checkmate. Alistair had outmaneuvered him one last time from beyond the grave. Abernathy put his glasses back on and looked at the will one final time. He turned his gaze, now devoid of all ambiguity, directly to the quiet woman sitting alone. According to the sworn statements of the attending nurse, as well as the corroborating, albeit hostile, testimony of Mr. Richard Blackwood, Miss Isabella Blackwood, and Mr. Samuel Blackwood, he declared, his voice resonating with legal finality, there was only one person present who provided the answer. He looked directly at Nora. "Miss Eleanora Vance," he said, bestowing upon her a formal title the children had never used, "answered correctly. The answer was time. Therefore, pursuant to the unassailable terms of this will, the entire Blackwood estate is now yours."
The verdict in the lawyer's office was not the end of the story. It was the explosive beginning of a global media circus. The tale of the maid who inherited the world became an overnight sensation. News vans camped outside the gates of the Blackwood estate, and, more absurdly, outside the humble walk-up apartment building where Eleanora Vance had lived for 40 years. Tabloids splashed her unassuming face across their covers, juxtaposed with images of Alistair's yachts and private jets. They spun wild, sensational theories. She was a master manipulator, a secret lover, a long-lost relative. The world, much like Alistair's own children, could not comprehend a reality where loyalty and attention were worth more than bloodlines and ambition. For the Blackwood children, the public humiliation was secondary to the declaration of all-out war. Led by a vengeful Richard, they marshaled a team of the most ruthless lawyers money could buy. They dragged Nora's name through the mud, painting her as a cunning, predatory caretaker who had taken advantage of a vulnerable old man. They launched a vicious legal assault, filing motion after motion to contest the will on grounds of undue influence and testamentary incapacity. They claimed the riddle was a proof of their father's madness, not a test of their character. But Alistair had been a master strategist to the very end. His final moves were as meticulously planned as any corporate takeover. The psychiatric evaluation conducted by an unimpeachable expert stood as an iron shield against their claims. Mr. Abernathy, loyal to his client's final brilliant maneuver, defended the will with stoic precision. And in court, the children's own testimonies became their undoing. Their raw, unfiltered greed, their dismissive descriptions of their father's final days, and their thinly veiled contempt for Nora painted a picture for the judge that was far more damning than any lawyer's argument. They proved Alistair's point for him. After a protracted and costly battle that drained their remaining personal funds,
The court upheld the will. It was final. The empire was Nora's. While the world watched and the children raged, Eleonora made her choice. She didn't move into the cavernous, lonely mansion. She didn't hire a staff of servants or buy a new wardrobe. The noise of her newfound fame and fortune was a terrifying intrusion on her quiet, orderly life. For the first few weeks, she stayed in her small apartment, the place where she had brewed her own tea every morning and read library books by the light of a single lamp. This small, unassuming space was her sanctuary, a fortress of normalcy against a world that had gone mad.
One day, Mr. Abernathy gave her the keys to the Blackwood estate. She went alone. She walked through the marble halls where her footsteps echoed with an unsettling loneliness. She ran a hand over the dusty, priceless furniture and looked at the portraits of stern-faced ancestors staring down from the walls. She realized then that this house wasn't a home. It was a gilded cage, a monument to a man who had everything, and in the end, had no one who truly saw him. She understood that the fortune was not a prize. It was a burden, a final, profound test from Alistair. Would she too be consumed by it? Her decision, when it came, was clear and resolute. She would not become a prisoner of the Blackwood fortune. Instead, she would set it free. Her first act was to establish a charitable foundation. She didn't name it after Alistair, but after the one person he had truly loved, his mother, Alara. The Alara Blackwood Foundation was endowed with the bulk of the estate's liquid assets, its mission statement a direct reflection of the values Alistair's children had ignored. It funded scholarships for underprivileged students who showed promise and grit. It created literacy programs in impoverished communities and provided grants for arts and music education in public schools. It was a legacy built not on hoarding wealth, but on creating opportunity. Her second act was to address the mansion itself. She sold off the cold, ostentatious furniture and the art collection that had been purchased as an investment rather than for love. And then she gave the building to the city. The great, lonely Alistair Blackwood estate was transformed. Its silent, gilded halls became the city's newest and most beautiful public library and art gallery. The oppressive silence was replaced by the whispers of children discovering new worlds in books, the excited chatter of students researching projects, and the quiet contemplation of people from all walks of life enjoying art that was now theirs to see. The place where Alistair had been so profoundly alone became a vibrant hub of community. Nora kept only one thing for herself, the small, worn-out book of poems, Echoes in the Gloom. As for the Blackwood children, their fate was a slow, quiet unraveling. Stripped of their inheritance and weighed down by crippling legal fees, their gilded worlds collapsed. Richard's reputation in the business community was shattered. No one wanted to partner with the man who had been so thoroughly and publicly outsmarted by his own father. Isabella, shunned by the high society circles that had once been her entire world, was forced to sell her jewels and move to a modest condo, a social pariah haunted by the ghosts of her former glory. Samuel, without the structure of his family's wealth, simply drifted, a man defined only by the fortune he had lost. They were left with nothing but their bitterness, a corrosive inheritance that they would carry for the rest of their lives, forever trapped in the shadow of the quiet maid who had listened when they had not. If this story moved you, tap the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and let us know where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories that deserve to be heard.